Alrighty, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming this evening. I work at the MFA Fine Arts program down the street. I've actually never been to this building, so I appreciate the opportunity to come here and see the building. It's embarrassing because I've been at SBA for years, so I should have been here at some point. But this is my first time. So my name is Kameelah Janan Rasheed. I'm an artist, I'm an educator, and I'm a writer. I'm based in Brooklyn. I moved to New York about 8 years ago from a small town in California. Actually, the photograph that you're looking at now is a photograph of my town in 1980. I was born in 1985, and most of my upbringing, this town actually looked exactly like this. And so the art for the presentation tonight is sort of to talk through some autobiographical information that sort of informs my practice, and then to move rather quickly through some work that is not lens-based, that does form some foundation for my work, and then to actually look at two projects that are more lens-based, that are also going in a variety of directions. And I think a lot of times when I give lectures, everyone assumes that it's about them, and I'm giving the lecture to be informative to them, which it is about, but it's also selfishly about me. These lectures give me a great opportunity to sort of sort through what it is I'm grappling with, and it helps me sort of think aloud and articulate some things that I haven't been able to articulate. But now, because I'm in public and it needs to be intelligible, I actually have the opportunity to think through a couple of things. So I grew up in a small town called East Palo Alto, and Facebook is behind my parents' house. We're right in the middle of Silicon Valley, and we didn't have a lot in our city. One of the things that our city was really great with was just educational institutions and programs that sort of allowed for young people to express themselves. And so one thing that we did have at our school was a publishing center, and it was this old woman who would sit in a trailer during lunch, and you could come in, you could write stories. She would type them out for you. You could pick your binding, you could pick your paper weight, you could pick your illustrations, do all of that, and you could publish books. And so these are two about the author pages from two of the dozen books that I published before I left second grade. The first one says, I'm 6 years old, my mom is a nice lady, I'm a nice lady like my mom, I have 6 people in my house, I have more people, I have 15 people, my grandpa died, my name is Kameelah. I was struggling obviously with writing complex and compound sentences. My mother also tells me there were not 15 people in our house, and we're still trying to figure out where those excess people came from. But by the time that I'm 7 years old, someone clearly taught me about complex sentences, the ability to use commas and things of that nature. So my name is Kameelah Rasheed. I'm 7 years old and go to flood school. 7 years old is very young, but I like to read, write, and do art. I live in East Palo Alto. I'm in the second grade. I'm a good reader. And so I kept these two things, and these are some of the few things that I do have from my childhood. Because as my mother says, most of my time was spent in these places, at the publishing center, at the library, or in some other capacity of writing and telling stories. And so from a very young age, I was very fascinated around telling stories, who got to tell stories, who was in those stories, and what it meant for me to be 7 years old and actually publish something that people would actually come to read. So these books ended up in our school library. They were deaccessioned when I left second grade, and they became incorporated to my family's library at home. But I was very fixated on reading and writing, and also being in a position of authoring a story, and what that meant for me as a young kid, a young black kid in a city that no one knew about or cared about, and what that meant for my stories to sort of circulate. So I've been a practicing artist for, I'll say since the age of 12. But I think more in a professional sense, that people actually recognize me as a professional artist since around I'll say 2011, being conservative with that. And a lot of people have been like, what is your practice about? And I'm like, I don't really know. I do a lot of different things. The way that I've been conceptualizing a lot of my work recently is thinking about it as in terms of an ecosystem. And thinking about an ecosystem as a system of interconnected things. And so a lot of my practice, I do stand-up comedy, I do poetry, I do performance, I build archives, I do large installations, I teach, I do a bunch of different things. And they're all connected by an interest in telling stories about black people. And a lot of people assume that I'm telling these stories for the purpose of helping other people see that black people are human, or helping other people see that black people have like nuance. But my work is actually really talking to other black people about recognizing the diversity and permutations of our own lived experience. And so regardless of what I'm doing, whether it's poem, whether it's a website, whether it's performance, whether it's stand-up, a lot of it and all of it is rooted in how do we tell more nuanced and rigorous stories about lived black experience. So I'm gonna walk through a couple of past projects that are not lens-based, but I think do give some insight into my work. And a lot of these projects are all installation and text-based, and a lot of these projects inform the way that I sort of jump into lens-based formats. So one part of my practice is I do these architecturally scaled collages in large installation and exhibition spaces. And a lot of this for me is rooted in my interest in thinking about space and architecture, but how we actually read histories and stories around Black people. And from a very young age, even though I didn't have the language to articulate this, I was very aware that the way that people read me and my history was in a very flat and linear and very non-nuanced way. Everyone assumed that everyone from my town who was Black had a particular lived experience. When I went to a private school for high school, everyone assumed that we all had the same lived experience. College, I kept going through these situations where I was interested in the ways that people were able to quickly flatten Black experience into this very, very, very condensed and non-nuanced and non-rigorous terrain. And so in my installation practice, a lot of what I'm doing is thinking about how do people read and how can we break up this linear path of reading. So a lot of the text that's involved in my installation is arranged up and down on the floor, sort of inviting a physicality that does sort of disrupt a linear reading of text and a linear reading of history as an invitation to slow down. I'm really interested in thinking about velocity in my practice. What does it mean to actually ask people to slow down and think about the directionality of their reading to actually be rewarded for slowing down versus being rewarded for quickly moving through a space? And so most of my practice in the past 2 years has been organized around working with photocopies. I used to have access to a print shop at the Lower East Side print shop for their residency, which you should all apply to. But when that program ended, I didn't have a etching press anymore. So I started working with the Xerox machine as a way to think through my practice to do something similar to or adjacent to printmaking without actually having access to a printmaking tool that I had access to before. And so for a lot of what ends up happening in my practice is that I'm working with these Xeroxes, I'm performing scores in the Xerox copy bed, either by introducing new forms of light, by dragging text across the page, by lifting things, by adding layers, by working with acetate, and I create thousands of individual pieces, and then they become collaged into these larger scale installations. So the images you guys just saw is from a show called A Supple Perimeter, or from an installation called A Supple Perimeter that was up at ICA Philadelphia last year as part of a show called Speech Acts, and I was really interested in thinking about language and Black poetics and how that intersects with experimental poetics and thinking through how we can break up a linear reading of history, but what poetry offers us as a way to narrate both past and futures, and thinking about collage as a format to sort of break up our compulsion towards comfort, our compulsion towards complete sentences, our fascination with things that have narrative resolution. And so for this installation here, there are over 300 individual pieces, and I had a very hopefully happy installation team that organized all of these pieces, and I usually work in this very elaborate process where I can have anywhere between like 300 pieces, and another part of the show, there are 2,500 pieces. So I very much like working very, very small to make small pieces, and then using the architecture of the space to collage larger installations. So these are a couple of the images of the photocopy pieces that were created. So I work exclusively with the photocopier, and it's important to me to work with a machine that only costs me $200 because I am interested in what types of work can be created from a humble tool. So working with something that is very, very limited in both its functionality, but also its cost to be able to produce something that could exist in an exhibition space. So I always like to joke to say that it cost me 8 cents to make these, and it cost me 8 cents to make these. And they're digitized, of course, and that's how they become like beautiful large prints, but knowing that it's an 8-cent piece of art, that's the starting point. This is a show that's up at the kitchen now as part of the Julius Eastman retrospective. And this is a piece that was in response to a lot of Julius Eastman's scores. He created these really beautiful scores. I was interested in thinking about musicality and rhythm in installation spaces, and similarly installed this work. This one has about 100 individual pieces, and again, all these works were created from photocopies, so dragging things across the bed of a photocopier, collaging things directly onto the bed of the photocopier, then digitizing them and then installing them directly into the space. And for me, it's very important to have differences in depth, and looking at the space is very interesting for me to have different textures and different tonalities. And if you've not already noticed, I don't use any other color other than black in my work. That's highly intentional. I'm interested in thinking about differences in tone and weights of paper and materiality versus differences in color in my work. This is from a show at Printed Matter that was looking at experimental poetry and particularly constrained writing techniques. It has a similar process. There are about 75 pieces in this. Again, everything produced from a photocopier. Again, an interest in thinking through language and what a language affords, but also what language is unable to afford us, and understanding the histories. And again, things are arranged in a way that sort of works against a linear reading. So things that are in the vitrines, things that are high up, things that are not complete sentences, that actually invite the viewer to engage in a reading process where they're completing sentences rather than relying on me as the artist to complete those sentences for you. And there's some more photographic work, which I'll get more into shortly. This is from a show that's up right now at MAW Gallery in Chinatown, which is a show that I'm calling Research Notes, because these are a series of photographs that are looking at the architecture and found compositions around New York City as inspirations for installation design later. And these, which I didn't even know they're over there, is from a project that's been ongoing since 2014, called How to Suffer Politely and Other Etiquette, which was a text-based project for the public that looked at constructions of affect policing. So this idea, following the murders of so many Black folks by police officers, not only the fact that people were killed, but the fact that the way that we narrated how people should feel afterwards became very interesting to me. And so using these large-scale posters as an opportunity to sort of talk through sort of the hidden scripts or the implicit scripting behind how people should react to suffering. And so creating these sort of large-scale sarcastic posters that exist in public spaces. This is in Glasgow, and this was in late 2016. It came down in 2017. And they've been touring the US and Europe for the past 2 years. And it's always interesting to see them in a variety of spaces and how people react to them. I'm mostly fascinated by the way that people make them about themselves. They're like, how was that time that someone told me I couldn't complain about my dinner? And I was like, it's not actually what that's about. But I'm happy you're trying to connect with the work. So I think, and I'll talk more about this later, and this is also just a very interesting presentation for me because I usually spend a long, graceful hour talking about all the things that I just talked about in 6 minutes. But I actually want to get to the lens-based work because I would say the work that I'm least comfortable with, but it's the work that I'm most excited about at this point because it creates such anxiety and discomfort for me, and I'm trying to work in that space of discomfort and anxiety as something that's generative. This is a piece that was up at the Venice Biennale last year as part of a collateral show there. And so I do a lot of large-scale text things that are interested in thinking about getting people to think in spaces and to pause. A lot of my work, again, is about velocity, asking for people to pause and to look and to listen and strategically be present in a moment rather than rushing through to something else. And these are a series of projections. I wrote a lot of these when I had to work, when I was traveling up to the Bronx in my first couple years at this nonprofit job, and I had a lot of time on my hands. So I used to sit on the train and write these short alliterative pairings, and when I had finished about 200 of them, I looked back at them and realized that they're all very, very dark and not optimistic, but was interested in what they meant collaboratively, but also what they meant individually, and realizing the role that humor and satire plays in my work as sort of an opening point or invitation for further conversation. So aggregated apathy, durable dystopia, flaccid futures, frugal fantasy, ghetto ghost, homicidal hemline, impotent integration, lethargic legislation, negligent nuisance, obedient outcomes, offshore optimism, panoramic patriarchy, plagiarized pleasure, redacted rage, soybean spaceship, tender truths. There's another one in here that's not included. It's called the gluten-free graveyard, which is actually my favorite one. I can see that as a future activity. And then, of course, it's these things that I do also as part of my practice. These lectures, these talks, these sort of discursive formats are also a large part of my practice. I used to be a high school teacher. I was a high school teacher up until 2013, and then I went to nonprofit curriculum development work, but teaching and performance and being in front of audience and improvising is very much part of my practice. I'm very interested in what is generated through that instantaneous interaction and conversation that I don't actually get when I put up work. But this actually engagement, talking with people, is something that I deeply enjoy and would like to make a greater part of my practice. So now we're gonna get into the uncomfortable stuff. Let's all take a deep breath. No, seriously, let's all take a deep breath. Alrighty, so a quick introduction to this work, Mapping the Spirit. This work is literally, and I'm only 32, so when I say it's been 15 years in the works, it sounds like hyperbole, but literally. Mapping the Spirit is a project that I've been thinking about since my very, very young age, like the age of like 15, 16, 17, when I was in a lot of different contexts that made me think a lot about religion and spirituality. And it wasn't until 2016 when I got funding from the Magnum Foundation that I was actually able to like publicly share the project. Before that, it was a lot of like behind the scenes, working with things, talking to people, trying to get things public, failing at a lot of stuff, being frustrated, and just feeling stopped and sort of deterred. And it wasn't until I just took this chance to apply in 2016 for this grant that I actually felt like things were starting to move. And so Mapping the Spirit is like very much rooted in my experience growing up Muslim in America. My parents did not grow up Muslim. My parents grew up Baptist and Methodist. That is me in the middle in the pink. That's my dad and my mom, and those are two of my brothers. Two more came after that, so there are 5 of us total. And so my parents grew up in Christian households. My mom has never been like very excited about religion, and a lot of that is rooted in the fact that when she was young, one of her mother's friends actually went to Guyana with Jim Jones and unfortunately passed away there. And for my father, he just struggled a lot with what religion meant to him and what Christianity meant to him. And so they spent a lot of time sort of searching, and they met each other at UC San Diego in the 70s when they were in college together, and sort of went on this journey together. My dad tells the story often where he says that he says that he felt like he was going from religion to religion to religion. It was like a buffet, and he was searching for something to make him full, but he never felt full. And that sort of story always like resonates with me because I think it says something about the search for a home or the search for something that satiates you, but also sort of reminds me that every religion that he sort of touched along the way ended up in our life in some capacity. And so we grew up in a Muslim household. Because my parents were Christian and their parents were Christian, we didn't celebrate Christmas, but our grandfather definitely brought us Christmas gifts on the 26th instead of the 25th. So it was clear that it wasn't for Christmas, but we were all like, it's for Christmas, like, you get it. And I went to Catholic school when I was in high school. I went to church with my friends. I went to Shabbat dinner. One of my good friends was Mormon, so I went to seminary with her, and all their school dances were gender segregated, so I could go to all their school dances. So I spent most of my adolescence in environments that were not strictly Islamic, and I sort of grew very interested in how people sort of gravitated to certain things, and what that sort of meant for my understanding of like who I was as a person. So around, I want to say 2009, I found this Berkeley folder of this binder of one of my dad's notes. So when he first converted to Islam, he learned Arabic. He spent a lot of time studying, and he had these notes where he would cut out different passages from the Quran or cut out these other passages from books, and then he would glue them all together and take all these notes on top of them and then type stuff over them. And so I have binders and binders full of like these notes, and I became very interested in how he ended up where he was, and started interviewing him and formally trying to very much understand how he became the person that he was, and how in turn we became the people that we were because we ended up following the religious faith that he introduced us to. And during that process of interviewing him, I became very interested in sort of thinking about this, not from the lens of like a universal, why do people go to different religions, but thinking about this in the context of Black people in America. Why do people gravitate towards different religious practices, and started collecting a bunch of stuff. So I started collecting as much ephemera and things that I could find about Black religious experience in the US. And so one of the first places that I started collecting were these religious tracts. And I don't know if you guys have seen these things, they pass them out in New York City a lot. I started collecting a bunch of these, so I was super fascinated by them. And I started also sort of going online and looking for pieces of pop culture that sort of spoke to Black religious experiences. I don't know if anyone has seen Good Days? Good Times? Good Times? Yes. So this is the episode about Black Jesus. And it's like one of my favorite episodes because it is so ridiculous in so many ways, but also deeply fascinating, them having this conversation. There's one point where him and his wife are getting this conversation, and she was like, maybe there's a Black Jesus, but I have a lifetime subscription to the real one. And he's like, well, what has he done for you lately? And they keep going back and forth. It was very interesting banter. But was again fascinated by how these issues were being brought up in pop culture and these black television shows in the 70s at a time where it seemed like this, maybe this is the least of our concerns, but seemed very important at this time to sort of under his power. So the video that I'm going to show you is a video that I took when I first moved to New York City in 2010. And I'm from a small town, and I thought the best way to get to know the city was to walk around the small town, to walk around New York City with a camera and a recording device, and that's how I would learn the city. So I would walk around, take photos of a bunch of things, take audio of a bunch of things, and then come home and be like, what did I learn today? It was I think that was wise. One of the things that did come out of that was that I came in contact with a lot of street preachers in the process and became fascinated by sort of like public faith and reactions to public faith. And this was an interaction that happened on August 7th of 2010. This is at Union Square when there was Whole Foods and the shoe store right next to it. And I'm just going to play this. Sometimes people ask if I scripted this. This is not scripted at all. This is like an actual interaction between humans. So it's good to keep that in mind. So I'm actually going to... authority today. Oops. Men and women, today you must bow your knee to Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior today. Men and women, I declare to you, you are not guaranteed tomorrow. Today is the day of salvation. Man, your heart, your mind, your mouth is wicked. I heard you earlier. And because of wicked mouth, it shows the deceitfulness of your heart.
Your mind.
Your mouth is wicked, ma'am. I heard you earlier.
Your mind.
And you know what that shows?
I'd rather your mouth to be wicked.
Are defiled before God, and you must be born again.
Do you know me?
We all must be born again. And I declare to you, only Jesus can make you born again today. Only Jesus can take out a heart of stone and give you a heart
I come to get all your spirits to believe in my bullshit, because it doesn't make any fucking sense. Okay? Listen, because he knows me. I don't know where he know me from.
And ma'am, I pray that God awakens you to truth.
Where you know me from?
Jesus is the way. He is the truth. So this is like a funny interaction, and as you can tell from some of the camera work, there was like my attempt to like blur it in and out and look at the dramatic. So this is like the first video that I ever made, and I remember going into, I think I may have been using like iMovie at that point, so I like wasn't even aware of so many things. And so I remember going in and being so excited. I was like, I can't believe I captured this. I remember I'm like going to turn to black and white, so I wanted to be like this like avant-garde. I had all these ideas. But the most fascinating thing about this was sort of this interaction between this man and this woman, but also the proximity that I was able, and I was using like a Nikon like D40, which is like 6 megapixels, like so old school. It was the first camera I got. But I was so excited about this moment of being able to capture something that I had witnessed so many times, but actually I thought was saying so much about how people were feeling, but also about the ways we think about religion as these containers that people just opt into versus like this spectrum of experience that people are constantly negotiating. This woman was interesting to me because she had a range of other interactions throughout the day that I recorded. And so from 2010 until about 2015, I started just collecting all these sermons on buses, on street corners, on trains. And so I made a conceptual mixtape, which is available privately if you want it, of sermons throughout the city because I was just interested in this vocality and just listening to these voices sort of interact in that context. And so that I'm not sharing today, but it's just an important part of so much of my work is about collecting a bunch of stuff without the actual knowing of what I'm going to do with it, but having this impulse or desire to collect a lot with the hopes that at some point it would become important. And so in 2015, a lot of this work became publicly important. It was always personally important to me because I applied to a program at NYPL through Triple Canopy to do research at the NYPL archives. And so this was supposed to give me an opportunity to put a lot of my interest of religion and thinking about black folks and related to religion and spirituality and the spectrum of experience and opting in and opting out, refusing into an actual research project. And so in 2015, I started this project with Triple Canopy in NYPL, where I was researching this group called the Moorish Science Temple of America, using the archives at Schoenberg and using the ones on 42nd. And that process literally took me 2 years. It was supposed to take like 6 months of like research, and I was going to output this paper, and it was all going to be great, but it literally took me 2 years to actually get this paper off the ground, because what ended up happening through that process is I started to think a lot about archiving. Who has to write their own images? Where do archives live? Why are certain images available? Why aren't certain images available? What does it mean to preserve rights to privacy and secrecy and intentional illegibility in this process of trying to better understand communities? And so what came out of this was this essay, which you can view online at Triple Canopy, called My God Has Another Name, which is an exploration of a lot of the stories, and I think you gave this to students to look at, so I won't belabor the point, but it's talking through sort of my dad's conversion, my involvement in that, but also thinking about what does it mean to archive a religious community that sort of operates on the fringe of society, on the fringe of an ecosystem of knowledge production that is legitimized. And so when that project was done, or midway through that project, I applied to Magnum Foundation, because I said that to myself, like, it's great to write this paper, but what I actually want to do is be able to think through how can I actually produce an archive of religious groups within Black communities that operate outside of the collection scope of most institutions. When you go to many institutions, there are archives about different religious groups, but if you're a new religious group, if you're a French religious group, if you're a religious group that people don't know about and don't care to know about, there isn't actually an archive to visit. And I was interested in what role I could play in this process of creating an archive, but while also acknowledging that this community had already created an archive for themselves through YouTube, through podcasts, through blogs, through Facebook pages. I wanted to find another way in to actually start creating something as well. And so what happened, my friend here, Robert Webb, I've known him for 11 years now, and when I met him, he was a Sunni Muslim, and then a few years later, he was Sufi, and then a few years later, he had joined another community. So during the time that I had known him, he had joined about like 5 or 6 different communities, which was great for me because I was like going along on this ride with him. And so the community that he sort of settled into was the Moorish Science Temple of America. And so for about a year and a half, I spent time with him, his family, with his community down in Memphis and in Philadelphia, documenting their community, talking to people, trying to get an idea of what it meant for them to have their experiences archived, what it meant for them to be photographed, what it meant for them to be part of a collection, and spending a lot of time and trying to think about intimacy and trying to think about ethics in this process of trying to create this archive of this community that exists in collection scope, but at the same time exists in a way that doesn't actually lend itself to them telling them their own stories. And so what came out of this is this digital archive called Mapping the Spirit. And Mapping the Spirit is sort of a culmination of everything from age 15 until present day in my thinking about religion and trying to sort of sort through what it actually is that I'm trying to do. And so Mapping the Spirit is sort of like a clearinghouse, an archive that situates my interests and my collaboration with these different communities. Again, the first story that I did was the Moorish Science Temple of America, and the next story that I'm doing is working on a community of Orthodox Black Jews in Crown Heights. And so in this process, and I'll quick through in a moment, I don't work with any communities that I don't know. So for this community, I knew someone in the community for 10 years. In the Orthodox Black Jewish community, I've known someone for about 7 years. So it's important for me when I'm photographing and documenting that I actually have relationships with people, and so that there's an actual feeling that this is a collaboration versus me going into a community, dropping in, getting a bunch of stuff, and then bouncing, and then producing a project. So for me, it's a back and forth collaboration. So the website is horizontally scrolling in the same way that you might arrive at an archive within an institution. There's an overview and historical note. There's a finding aid. And what I do want to emphasize is that there are 102 objects in this archive that don't exist in any other collection, in any other public collection. And so there are photographs, interviews, video, a variety of things, and they're organized in the same way that you would find a finding aid at the institution, but I'll keep scrolling. So when you roll over, changes colors, identify that you're there. In the same way that you might save things in an archive, you can drag things down. save items. You can also click in, and then clicking in, you can get a larger view of the photographs. And so the image that you guys just saw there was the sheikh, who's the leader of the community in Philadelphia. And in their second floor of their temple, they have a bunch of old photographs that he allowed me to take photos of. But these are original photographs, and these are the only ones that we know exist right now. And so it was quite an honor to be able to photograph those and to be able to share those, and to continue to work with them. So this process is still continuing. I'm gonna go back again in a couple of weeks, and we'll continue and continue and continue, pretty much until I'm not here. And I think that's what I like about this project. This is sort of a project that continues to exist, because there's no way to sort of finish a story that is not finished itself. So I kind of like working from the iterative stance of being able to constantly engage with these communities repeatedly. And there's also a way to cite, because as people working in lens-based work, we always want to have credit for our work, so you can copy a citation as well. Here are a couple of images of their Holy Quran. They gave me a copy of an annotated one that looks like a child wrote in, and then also one of the congregants also wrote in as well. And I think that in just thinking about issues around ethics and documented communities, the one thing that was very important to me was the fact that there was a trust that was built up over time, where it became possible and mutually beneficial and enjoyable to actually share with one another. I'm going to actually show you guys a video. Of course, I have to log in. Great. So we're not going to watch that video, guys. My apologies. Oops. But I will click through interviews. And what became very certain in this process of working with them is that there's a bit of frustration with the fact that a lot of people are involved in documenting them and writing stories about them without actually coming in contact with them. And so for me in this process, it was super important for me to actually spend time again, but also to send things back to them after I had created them to say, is this accurate? Did I capture this correctly? While also maintaining my integrity to say that maybe you don't like the way this sounds, but this is what you said, and balancing that with an actual desire to be ethical in the process to allow people to be represented in the ways that they want to. And the last thing I'm going to show from this one is this image here. This is their Moorish Guide, which is the newspaper that they produced. It had been out of production for several years, and then in January 2017 was the first issue that was published, I want to say in about a decade. And they also allowed me to have a copy of that, and it's organized in the same way that you would see anything like the Final Call or other types of Black religious publications, organized in the same fashion. And so much of this work with the Moorish Science of America, again, was organized around archiving and thinking through how do I take a role in that, but also thinking through questions around privacy and intentional illegibility. And so one of the issues that I had to deal with in this process, and it was a fun challenge, was thinking through how do I negotiate what I'm allowed to hear, and how do I negotiate with how I filter what I'm allowed to hear with what people outside of this community and what I'm allowed as a trusted visitor to the community I'm allowed to hear. And so there are a lot of conversations I had with myself, conversations that I had with my husband as well around how do I actually tell this story in ways that are ethical, but also in ways that maintain privacy and safety and secrecy for communities, because most Black religious groups in the U.S. have been surveyed by the government, and there's a deep concern over being involved in that again and wanting to have an image of their community that doesn't invite further investigation, that doesn't invite further suspicion, and being mindful of that in this process as well. And this is an image of one of the identification cards that was issued in 1940 from Schoenberg's collection, and then a photograph of a recent one that was given to my friend Robert Webb when he joined. I'm gonna, 7:35. I'm going to jump into the last project that I want to talk about, and this one also makes me super anxious, but I'm going to talk about it anyway because that's what I'm here to do. It's a collection of Black vernacular photographs, and also rooted in my interest in archiving, also rooted in my interest in thinking about how do we tell more nuanced and rigorous stories about Black people, but also brings a lot of concerns with me around privacy and ethics as well. And so in 2012, this is my dad actually, in 2012, not 2012, excuse me, when I was 12, which was 2000, someone else can do math, I'm 32 now, so 20 years before, I don't even know. But when I was 12, our family became homeless. And so one of the things that happened is that when we became homeless, we had to leave this house. We moved into the 2 back rooms of my grandmother's house, which wasn't an enjoyable experience. That's what happened. My parents were like, you have like a box. Put as much as you can in a box, and that's all you take with you. And so in the process of doing it, we just lost a lot of stuff. So a lot of photographs were lost. A lot of like ephemera and other things that you might associate with like your childhood, which was like, we just didn't have them anymore because we were concerned about what can 7 people fit in 2 small rooms? And so from a very young age, I was constantly fascinated by the fact that I didn't have photos of myself, many photos of my family, and what that meant for how I viewed myself, what that meant for like, I may be a very, very adolescent feeling of how will people know that I existed if there are no pictures? And consequently, how will people know that my family existed if there were no pictures? And so this is one of my favorite pictures, the picture that we did manage to keep. This is my eldest brother, and that's a picture of him on the wall, and this is a moment that's interesting that I talk to my mom about a lot. This is him pointing at himself. And sort of this self-reflexive moment, this self-referential moment is really interesting to me, because even if this isn't what the moment is about, what the moment always meant to me was this moment of recognizing yourself in a photograph, and that being an interesting and important moment of self-discovery and recognition, but also just sort of a reminder of presence and visibility. And so when I was younger, I wanted to sort of fill in this gap of trying to figure out how do I actually replace all the things that were gone. And I could not obviously go and get a bunch of photographs. That was not possible. So midway through college, I started collecting photographs of Black people. I would go to estate sales, I would go to flea markets. When eBay came around later, I would go on eBay. I went everywhere that I could sort of find photographs of Black families without necessarily the goal of replacing my own. It wasn't like I was going and be like, oh my God, I'm gonna find my family's photo. It was more of, how can I find photos that approximate to a feeling or a domestic setting that felt familiar? And the first set of images that I found were at a flea market in Berkeley, California. I remember I was with my mom, and there was a man who was selling photographs. He was clipping his toenails over the photographs. But I still went in there, guys. And I was like, what's that? He's like, oh, there were just some photographs. And I was like, cool, we're gonna shake your toenails off of this. And we're gonna dive in, and there were just these photographs of Black families. And I became fascinated by, A, why you're clipping your toenails over these photographs. But B, he seemed to be able to part with them so quickly. And I became sort of fascinated with sort of the ability that he had of parting with them so quickly. And I was like, this is a still. Like I got like a gang of photos for very, very cheap. I don't remember how much I paid for them. I remember taking them home. I remember looking at them. I remember being very fascinated by them, and sort of lit this fire underneath me. This very, very deep impulse to keep collecting, keep collecting, keep collecting. And so we're now in 2018. There are about 4,000 photos. And this process, it has been interesting to me because sometimes it's quite sad to like look at all these photos and realize none of them are of you. But there's also an interesting process of looking at these photos and saying, I remember my grandmother had a couch like that. I remember I had a toy like that. There are also these scary moments of finding photographs where people or kids are standing in places and you know that you have a photograph of the same thing. There's a girl who's in a blue dress standing near a couch with a shopping cart. I have the exact same photo, and I did not include those because it's eerie, and I'm still negotiating how to share things. But those moments for me end up being very gratifying and just sort of remind me around, for me, the purpose of photographs not being a representation of yourself, but also just the moment of like eerie approximation or eerie echoing that become important. So last year with all these photographs, they've been sitting in these boxes under my couch for quite some time, and I wanted to figure out how to make them public or how to make use of them. And my deepest concerns about making the photographs public had a lot to do with the fact that these photographs are not mine. These photographs are someone else's photos. These people don't know me. I don't know them. And I started having a lot more collections of photographs around the time that a lot of museums and galleries and institutions were doing these shows around archives, people creatively using archival images, found images. And I used a few in a couple shows, but always felt deeply uncomfortable because I'm like, I never talk to people. Do they want their photos public? What responsibility do I have in using and making use of these photos? And so earlier this year, which is only like 29 days ago, and late last year, I started to grow more comfortable with using the photos that I set on them for literally a decade, and started going through them and trying to figure out how do I actually share these with the public. And so what I'm working on now is I'm working with a digital archivist who's scanning in all 4,000 photos. And so I'm going to share a couple of the photos with you guys tonight. I'm going to ask that you don't take photos of the photos because I still want to negotiate how they are shared. And I want to be as mindful around issues of privacy as possible because I just want to be mindful of those things. So there are lots of Polaroids that I found. These are a couple of my favorites, this being one of my favorites because I don't understand the context of her standing next to the helicopter. But I love her outfit, and it's just sort of the juxtaposition is strange, but also like very exciting to me. This is the photo, this is one of my favorite photos also. There are tons of photographs of like Black women who are striking these beautiful poses. There's always like a white Jesus in the background. I don't know what that's about, but there's always a white Jesus hanging out somewhere. But these photographs are fascinating to me. Because of the sense of pride and elegance that's in them, the fact that her like afro is literally touching the ceiling and she doesn't seem to care. And once I go through these photos, I'm gonna speak more theoretically around my interest in photographs and listening and ideas around Black quiet. A couple other photographs. Loving the textiles in a lot of these images. This kid's facial expression, which is doing a lot for me. And this like faux sheepskin situation that's occurring. There are tons of photographs of people just hanging out on couches, and this has been the most fascinating thing as I've gone through a lot of these photographs of people just doing the most banal, basic, mundane things. And I guess I said I was going to talk about this at the end, but I guess I'll talk about this now. What's been fascinating to me is that maybe last year, I don't remember when this happened, but someone approached my work and was like, I feel like you're like reticent or withholding, or like something about being quiet or not being expressive, and I kind of like was offended, and then I was kind of, I had to sort of search through myself to figure out like where that desire for me to be expressive or colorful or loud was coming from, and there is this expectation around Black culture being expressive and loud without understanding that Black people also experience interiority. Black people also have mundane, basic experiences like picking out this tie they're gonna wear, or figuring out what cereal they're gonna wear, or sitting on the couch and watching television. And so one of the things that these photographs are most important to me, what makes them most important to me is they show a nuance of Black experience that reminds us that Black people are also human and do basic things like everyone else. So sitting on the couch, watching TV, combing someone's hair, laughing, putting on clothes, and these photographs are a reminder that we're thinking, that we're having a contemplative moment, that we are engaged in something that's not outwardly expressive for public consumption, but something interior is occurring that is also worth imagining and thinking about. Tons of pictures before dances or dates. I don't know if people take date pictures anymore, but a lot of these are really beautiful to me, at least in someone's interest in capturing this. And a lot of the furniture reminds me of the furniture that I've seen in other Black families' photographs. Couple pictures, this fellow here is about to smoke something. Photographs that are also damaged end up being really interesting to me. So because a lot of these photographs that I'm getting, particularly from eBay, they're not always in the best condition when I receive them. And some at the beginning that used to frustrate me because I only wanted the pristine ones. But as you'll see in a couple images later, the ones that are not so pristine also end up being really interesting to look at as well. This woman here who's giving this interesting side-eye situation, she reoccurs in my collection several times. The one interesting thing about this process is that I'll buy a collection from someone, and they're never donor details. Someone will say, like, I found this in an abandoned house, or I found this in a dumpster, but then I'll buy another collection from someone else, and there's a photograph of that same person in someone else's collection far away. And so there's these interesting moments, and I because I'm a deeply spiritual person, I take this process as like a very spiritual process of like reuniting these photographs and thinking about these moments of these photographs being hauntings, and thinking about this in the context of Avery Gordon, who talks a lot about haunting. And these being a reminder that I need to do something with them. Not sure what I'm going to do with them, but knowing that something needs to be done with them. Lots of photographs of people in the 50s just sort of hanging out in very dapper outfits. But again, these moments of joy, and again, just like these mundane moments of just hanging out. She's back. These photos that are crackled a bit autopoilers and under certain weather and temperature conditions. These very, very interesting and gaudy lamps, but I don't. These also plastic over furniture was a big thing. In my upbringing, you weren't actually supposed to sit on furniture, you were supposed to just look at it. And so looking at a lot of photographs and noticing the preciousness that a lot of the furniture and other things in the home are treated with. And I, as a person who loves textile and doesn't use color at all in my work, these photographs are a great reprieve for me to look at color, even if I don't want to use color directly in my work. Yeah. A lot of these photos, there are a couple of photographs of like gel photos that I didn't include, but I want to figure out how to include in some future work. But a lot of these pictures of like just posing and hanging out. Look on the back. This torn photo is really beautiful to me, just because her arm is literally flapped up. And I'm also curious about who was cut out of this photo, because clearly someone was cut out of this photo. And I think that what's interesting and becomes very fulfilling for me is sort of thinking through the stories of these photographs, the things that are not said, the things that are said, what it means that someone's cut out, what does it mean that someone's face is scribbled over. Got the Ajax and Dawn in the background, microwave, fishing. Horrible furniture. And there are a set of photographs that are, several of them are just heads that are cut off, where the faces are almost never visible. But someone still developed those photographs, and me being fascinated also by a set of photographs that end up in someone's collection where identity is not possible. It's not clear who the person is. There are tons of like lounging photographs of people at picnics, people at benches, people eating, people just laughing. Tons of army photographs, tons and tons and tons of military photographs. And tons of photo books. So midway through this process of collecting all these photographs, someone figured out that photographs of Black people were coveted, and there was a moment on eBay where the prices spiked, and people were actively selling like that photograph there could go for $75, because there was an awareness of scarcity at a particular point, and people were collecting them for cheap and then selling them back. And so one part that's important for me in this process is that none of these photos ever get resold. They never go back into circulation, because part of me purchasing a lot of these photos, in my mind, a lot of that was around like a rescue mission of trying to recapture them or take them away from people who thought about these as commodities versus as someone's actual memories that should be in some capacity revered or used in a way that isn't just a shuffling of photographs of Black people through transaction, which to me felt too close in proximity of shuffling Black bodies for transaction. So I wanted to remove them from that circulation. One thing that was a lot of fun for me is that sometimes you'll get, unfortunately this one you can't see any street signs, but sometimes you'll get street signs, and being able with their technology today to figure out where that actual location is. And so I have a set of photographs that are about 16 blocks away from my grandmother's house in Los Angeles. Here are the photos. There are so many of these. You just know who these people are. So quick side note about this gentleman here. He was having a romantic situation with someone. He had a selection of nudes, which I did not include in this. But when I got the question, I was like, really? But I was like, you know what? He has has the right to send his nude as well. So in this collection of 4,000 photographs, there are tons of like folks in outfits that they're like sending, their pictures that they're sending to a significant other or a potential significant other. And I'm fascinated by them because in that process, someone had to take that photo, you had to then get it developed, then you had to write a note on the back, and you had to mail it. It's like a long, month-long process versus when we send stuff nowadays, it's like a couple of seconds. So I was interested in the commitment involved in like composing a photograph, writing a note, getting it developed, sending it off. Like there's a whole thing involved, which I'm fascinated by. There's sort of this ghosting that occurs with a lot of the older photographs as well. Folks riding horses, getting your hair done, hanging out. And I have spent like hours looking at a lot of these photos, just even matching textiles in different photographs. There are lots of photos like these where someone's obviously trying to take photos and people are not being cooperative. So you get these like time-lapse photographs as well. This one here is one of the ones that was sent to a potential boo. Some more recent photos, the ones that are from 1995 onward are the most eerie to me because they're parts of my upbringing that are most familiar, just in clothing, just in like things that are shown on television in some of the photographs. This child here was not too happy about this photograph. And I like so many of these because they're in domestic settings and give us some insight into that. Marcia Yax Alonso, shut up. So just like the fun of these, and so I'm going to show you a couple of the backs of the photographs because one of the things that I asked the digital archivist to do was to also scan the back because I was interested in sort of like the cartography of the back of the photographs and what they tell us, but also there's lots of text on the back of these photographs. So to Owen, Juanita, 40 more, okay, this is from 1984. To Aunt Maddie, to an aunt I'm proud to have in the family, stay so sweet as you are, your niece Maddie. To Renelle with sincere thanks. This is in Panama City, Florida. We rented a condo for a week. I love you. I'm happy now, only to know I'll be crying later because I'm so much in love with somebody. Rock and roll. Good eye. Rock and roll idol that every girl in New York cares. 4-2, smile. I don't know what that one's about. So I have lots of feelings about these photographs. And right now the plan is to digitize all of them and to make them available online with parameters around obviously use and parameters around viewing because I do want the images to be shared. I do want people to engage with them, but I also want to just be mindful of how they circulate. I don't want them to become commodities again, but I actually want them to be historical artifacts that people can use to create insight around versus being circulated for transaction. And I guess I just want to end on a note about why I think the work with archives and trying to tell the wide permutations of lived Black experiences is important, while also recognizing interiority and quiet as a suitable position for people to take in this context. And so I'm going to read one thing from this book that you should all get, Listening to Images by Tina. I'm just going to read an excerpt. It's from page 45 of this text. And it just really struck me because it articulated a lot of what I've been thinking about as I'm looking at these photos, a lot when I'm also taking the photos for this other project. She writes, what is the frequency of these images? Quiet. A quiet hum full of reverb and vibrato. Not always perceptible to the human ear. We feel it more in the throat. To look at these images is to see genre and form. To look at them is to look through their sitters and see function and format. To oversee them in ways in which Black people have been erased and overseen for centuries. To listen to them is to be attuned to their unsayable truths, to perceive their quiet frequencies of possibility. The possibility to inhabit a future as unbounded Black subjects. Listening to these images gives us access to something much more mediated and perhaps far more powerful. The hum of utopian dreams and diasporic aspiration. It is the hum that resonates the unsayable truths of Black folks at the lower frequencies of quiet photography. And that passage really strikes me because I think that when I first started talking about this archive, everyone was like, "This is an archive about like revolution or like radical visibility or about this," and I was like, It's not actually any of those things. It's literally about asking people to like strategically just listen and understand that quiet is a position that can be taken for Black people, and that Black people engage in quiet contemplation, and that these photographs are a reminder of being able to engage in that. And a reminder that there are things that you'll listen for that you won't be able to hear, or there are things that some people will listen for they won't be able to hear. And that interiority and thinking about those contours and thinking about having a density as Black people is super important to me. And so I'll just end on, two or three references, and thinking about them as sort of like a lineage of thinkers and references that sort of shaped my work, particularly this project. And just thinking all the way back to 1935 and thinking about Zora Neale Hurston and Of Mills and Men, where she's talking about collecting folklore stories and talking about the difficulty of collecting these stories and thinking through what is unsayable, what is sayable, and this sense of evasiveness that Black people have around people asking them questions, particularly white people asking them questions about who they are and what they are doing, and that sense of freedom associated with being able to talk about yourself freely, and being able to preserve a sense of quietude for protection, but also for a desire to remind people that quietude is a place to occupy. And then going into 1940, thinking about Richard Wright and 12 Million Black Voices, where he writes this sentence where he says, "You usually take us for granted and think you know us, but our history is far stranger than you suspect, and we are not what we seem." Which always is a good reminder, again, of people trying to read so much into things without thinking about the necessity of just slowing down and accepting quiet as a position to take. And not a Black thinker, but I would like to say that he's speaking in the context of this, gesturing towards this. There's a 1980s essay in The Nation by Edward Said called Islam Through Western Eyes, where he talks about human density and the necessity to confer human density onto people who don't have human density because their narratives are constantly flattened, and thinking about these photographs that I've been collecting as an opportunity to confer human density onto people, Black people in history who have not been afforded that privilege. And then Kevin Quashie, he wrote this book called The Sovereignty of the Quiet, which is again a reminder about the quiet and what the quiet is able to convey. And I'll just end on Arthur Jaffa, who a friend went to a talk and posted this on Facebook years ago, and I checked with him to make sure he said it. So I'll be correct in saying this, but he was talking about Black complexity and Black identity, and he says there's no such thing as a simple Black person. You can't survive this context and be simple. And so a lot of my work is sort of thinking through how do I remind us that Black histories are not simple but involve complexity, which range from the very quiet to the very expressive, and thinking about the quiet and the expressive as not polar opposites, but a spectrum that is permissible to operate within. And I'll end there.
Open up for questions. If there are any questions?
Just a comment. It seems to me that in addition to banality, establishing a commonality amongst Blacks could also just be a meeting ground for everybody.
Say it once more.
Banality, I understand the historical project, but it seems to me it can be even more than that. It can be a meeting ground for everyone.
I mean, that's an interesting product. It's not a product that I'm like invested in my work. My work is very much situated in talking about Black people. I think that the project of like trying to find a universal center for everyone has been too long the project, and I think that it's been done at the cost of not understanding the nuance and rigors of Black folks. And so for me, my work is situated in Black people and trying to surface that nuance, but I think that other people can contribute to the work of finding a universal center. It's just not the purpose of my work. I don't know if I'm calling people.
Candace.
How do you see this new work with the archival materials fitting in if it does at all, like, or if it's in dialogue with Lorna Simpson's work, where she did.
Say it, I'm sorry for some
Do
of
you
that.
see it in dialogue with Lorna Simpson's work, where she did use archival family albums between these two African American couples, and then she posed herself in similar, like, almost literally very similar poses as well, but where her work was addressing more, I think, issues about femininity and sort of like sexuality a little bit. How, do you see your work kind of like in dialogue with that body of work?
I like how you gave the mic at the end. I one thing that I've been trying to do more coherently with my work, and even talking to my students, is thinking about how my work exists in the ecosystem, not of just my own practice, but outside of my practice, and sort of like a dialogue or a lineage. So I think in the way that Lorna Simpson is doing work around the restaging, I'm very interested in presenting the photographs as they are without any of my interference at all. I'm very interested in what happens when people engage with them. The hope is that one day I will have a physical space large enough to house all of these where people can come and see them, because the haptic engagement with the images is also important. So to actually touch a photograph, to feel the actual like crust of a photograph, to see the tape peeling off, I feel like are all important parts of experiencing that. And so I want to be able to have like a multi-sensory engagement with it, but I do definitely look in the direction of work like that. And I think it's a good reminder that many of us are thinking about what do we do with all these, I keep calling them orphan photos. What do we do with all of them? Because it is sort of like a moment of being haunted by them. You have all these things, and there's this sense that you have to do something with them. You just can't hold on to them. And I feel like in a lot of the work that I'm seeing around using photographs of Black folks from found archives, from personal archives, is around this desire to do something with them, to make them public, to make them part of a conversation, for them to circulate in a way that allows for a slow digestion engagement.
I guess this goes a bit off of what Richard was speaking about. One quote that I found very interesting of what you were writing, the impotent integration. I come from an area, from Mississippi, grew up on the Gulf Coast, come from a multiracial family, and I have a lot of Black friends, spend time as an outsider, visitor in Black communities, and I definitely see very importance of keeping culture intact, keeping heritage, keeping the traditions alive, and also how do you deal with Black culture being open and developing? How do you deal with that without? How do you deal with that in your practice?
Can you rephrase the last word?
Like people. So one problem, one trouble. So how do you deal with things of people multi-racial Black people, with multi-racial identities in Black culture?
How do I deal with that?
Right. I guess you're doing it with. How do you deal with? Do you deal with it outside of? You can do it with voodoo, other things, or I don't know. There's also the new Nation of Islam that, for me, is problematic. That developed in Mississippi. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
So is your question, how do I deal with Black people for whom who have intersecting identities?
Yes.
Well, I mean, that's all Black people. And I think so. I think that that's something that's like intuitively and naturally integrated into the work. There's no way for me to talk about my family history without talking about other people. There's no way for any Black person in America to talk about Black people and their work in the context of that.
You're saying Black. Okay, how far back are we going with the Black? I don't want to go to everyone comes from Africa, because then that makes sense. At what point do you draw a line?
So are you asking how I identify who is Black?
I guess, yes.
Okay, so let's start there. How do I identify? I don't make that decision, right? People are opting into that, right? So I can't say you're Black, because that's not my right to do that. And so for me, I work from the center of folks who are choosing to self-identify and for who have already been historicized as part of a Black community. And so even people who are identified as multiracial, people who are identifying as Creole, a lot of archives include these communities as well, because the legacy of of slavery includes all these people, whether they want to be included or not. And so for me, I don't really take it as like a tension or like something to figure out. History is complex enough that it's elastic and supple enough that it can absorb and contract and retract as needed, but I don't see it as a conflict or a tension.
You see your work as an extension or similar to Deborah Lewis's work?
I love Deborah. I would not say I'm an extension because she might come here and say, no, you're not. So I wouldn't say that as an extension, but I think similar to the question before, I'm definitely in conversation. And I think that conversation is a more participatory way to talk about relationships between artists, because I think that when we say that we're in a lineage of or an extension of, it suggests a genesis or a relationship where there is an actual conversation. So I would like to say that I'm in conversation with a lot of folks, Black women who are working with photographs, who are working with lens-based work, but I don't want to say I'm an extension. We're like in an ecosystem. We're all sort of working alongside one another with the hopes of like producing something that creates nuance and different ways of reading and thinking through Black histories.
I'm interested to hear you speak towards like balancing these different sides of your practice and incorporating different mediums, presenting in different ways, and obviously, you know, maintaining research-based interests in all these different fields at the same time, and yeah, like the convergence of that and channeling that into, you know, continuing to create work in an organized.
Tiffany, you know this is a tricky question. I know you're going to do this to me.
Very biased.
Yes. No, it's a good question. So I think early on I used to not do things because I couldn't see how it actually fit into what I was doing. I was like, well, that thing over there is about like ecosystems or it's about like invasive species, so you can't talk about this in your practice because it's outside of what you said you were doing. And so a couple years ago I just decided to make whatever I wanted, and then I would let the process of synthesizing and figuring out where they all relate to one another happen later. And so much of my process, and I thought about this last year too, it was like so much of my practice is about being like, I'm an artist and I exhibit in like major institutions, but I also do like classes, and it became overwhelming to constantly qualify everything that I was doing, and I decided that I wasn't gonna call myself an artist. I said that I was gonna call myself a learner who makes her learning visible through a bunch of different ways. And so for me, even though I still fall into the artist category, because when I apply for grants, I want you to know that I'm an artist. You give me some artist money, because no one wants to pay for learning. But as a person, I very much love learning. And I spent all my background and training is in education, pedagogy, and curriculum development, because I actually love the process of learning. I like the cognition, understanding what is happening in your brain when you absorb a new idea and have to figure out how it connects to a bunch of other things. And so for me, it was less of a rebranding, but more of me being honest with myself to say that I learn a lot of different stuff every day. Every single day. Every single day I learn something new. Every single day I'm like in this process of trying to negotiate all of that. And instead of boxing myself in and saying, I can't do this or this is about that, I'm just like, well, today I learned about blah, 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 and I decided to write a poem about it. And the other day I decided to learn about blah, 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 and I decided to make an installation about it. What has ended up happening, though, is that when I look back at the trajectory of my work, there are themes that always come up, and I think that's naturally going to occur. I love biology. I'm taking a climate change class right now. Something's going to happen with climate change at some point, and I'm sure someone's going to be like, what does climate change have to do with Black people? And I'm like, let me tell you, we're all connected, right? And so for me, I taught a research class down the street last semester. It was just a workshop. But one of the places that I started was Octavia Butler, because everyone knows who Octavia Butler is. If you don't know, just shake your head anyway, because it's shameful, and find out who she is later. But I'm really fascinated with Octavia Butler because of her actual writing, but because so much of her practice was around syncretism and literally allowing herself to make whatever the hell she wanted to make, and then figuring out how it connected later. And so she was interviewed by Samuel Delaney for this MIT blog like in the 90s, and he's asking her about hypertext and like the internet. She's like, I don't use the internet, I don't engage, like I don't do that. But she says she does engage with something called a primitive hypertext. And so for her, that means that she's working on a project. She may also be learning about gardening. She may also be listening to an audiobook. She may also like go for a walk. And so she's allowing her mind to drift, and then seeing how that drifting allows for her to generate better ideas in the end. And so for me, my practice is very much like, do you guys know what sensory gating is? It's literally your ability, it's your ability to block out any sort of sensory stimuli that has nothing to do with what you're doing right now. I don't have sensory gating. So when I'm walking down the street in New York, even if I'm talking to you, I'm also listening to everything else that's happening over here. There's a smell that's happening over here. There's a bunch of things that's happening. And it used to like very much be much of a hindrance, but I found ways to then channel that into other ways of developing my practice, which is to say every single piece of stimuli and learning or interaction that I have becomes integrated into my practice in some way. And so I don't have any balance in my life. I work a full-time job in an adjunct MFA program down the street, and like I don't have balance in my life. That's not even a real thing. It's a trick question, but I do feel very comfortable when I'm describing my practice. Say like I'm learning stuff and then I'm trying to show what I'm learning, and it ends up actually being around this thing most of the time, and sometimes it's just not, and I'm okay with that. Hopefully that answered. Okay, cool.
I have like one more question. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the way you organize and archive like the massive amount of material.
Yeah, well, I would love an intern. So right now, what I've gotten funding once for this particular archive, and so what has happened in that case is just literally taking all these boxes, digitizing them, tagging them, and putting them in these photo-safe sleeves, and then storing them in like a dark closet because I don't have like a climate-controlled house. One day. So a lot of the process is intuitive because at the beginning of this, I didn't really understand archival science or understood archival science in the way that was professionalized, and I have my own opinions about. But I think as a person who didn't understand archival sciences, I was still a black person in America for whom much of ephemera and things that actually tell stories of ourselves either don't exist or are in some ways damaged or not accessible. And so I think that I paid attention a lot to like what my mother did to save photographs. She put them in Ziploc bags and she always put them under the bed. Or I paid attention a lot to how like other family members flattened out like obituaries and then put them in a manila folder. So there are small things that I sort of picked up from just like everyday living. They knew that this stuff wasn't going to end up in Schoenberg or some other place, so they knew they had to do it. That became part of my practice. So I still use Ziploc bags. I use the photo-safe bags from Talis. Digitizing helps a lot. Now I got married for the purpose of having someone else to help me. No, I didn't. But it does help. So I think a lot of my process is intuitively organizing things. Right now with this collection, we're organizing photos by size because not all of them have date information, hoping that the size of the photograph gives us indications of the type of camera that was used, and then that will give us indications of the range of time for the photograph. So right now we're organizing them by size. And then from there, creating a large spreadsheet for all that stuff to organize. But it's like a monster task that I realize I'll need lots of help with, but it's also fun to sort of look at things again and again and again to think about how they can exist in a range of different categories. But yeah, it's love an intern. Put it out there. But yeah, it's archiving is a professional practice. But I also think that marginalized communities have been archiving for such a long time, either sewing things into like the hems of skirts to make sure that they get safely delivered, or putting things in the back of Bibles or writing notes in those contexts. I also feel like those forms of archiving should also be privileged and talked about in the same context. So I think that they survived this many years. I think that they're obviously something that's good about them.
Around 2000, I think it was, Thelma Golden introduced or mentioned art being post-racial.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you were somewhere around 15 about then. So you
Sure.
Had 17 years or so of making this work. Some of it's gone farther back.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on post-racial art now?
Why don't you open a can of worms for the end of the talk? Ask at the beginning of the talk. So I have all.
I'll take the 2-minute answer.
There you go. See, he's smart. I struggle with periodization that includes prefixes like pre and post, mostly because I think that those are artificial attempts at periodization, but I think that they occur because we're trying to contain and make sense of time that is very, very confusing, so I understand them as they exist. Me, second to. I don't have feelings necessarily about post-racial art, because I don't even know who that would include and what that means now. But I am interested in our desire to place what is occurring at particular moments on a timeline that is so very neat and not messy. I don't know if that makes sense. David S. Scott wrote this book called Conscripts and Modernity, which he's talking about post-colonialism in the Caribbean, and he talks about sort of our compulsion towards narrative arcs that are very comfortable. So a romantic narrative arc where there's an uprising and they defeat the person who needs to be defeated, and then everyone rides off into this beautiful future. And he talks about sort of like the problems with those narrative arcs, and he goes into tragedy and talks about how he believes that tragedy is a more productive and generative way to think about history, because it's full of contingencies and full of reminders that any of your efforts can be reversed or never actually accumulate into the thing that you want. And so when I think about things like post-racial art, I think it's a conversation worth having, but it's not a conversation that I situate myself in necessarily, because I don't know what those periodizations are useful. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I feel like I did not end that very well.
You look dissatisfied.
I was dissatisfied because I have so much more to say, but we don't have time for that. My background is in history, so I'm like fascinated with the way that we narrate history and our attempts to create periodization. I think is an interesting project. Stop looking like that to me.